Welcome everybody to the Classic Planning STOA, day 3 of what is now the second online session in a year. This is day 3, and we're going to start with some housekeeping. Ground rules for the event today are that the traditional architecture gathering environment, actually now called the STOA. We are rebranding TAG here in deference to the traditional architecture group in the RIBA, Robert Adam and Mike Wilson Jones, Robert was the founder. So we're heretofore the STOA. This is an environment of open-mindedness and quality of discourse. Participants are encouraged to debate each other's ideas from positions of mutual respect and good manners. By joining a session or online thread, you agree to avoid ad hominem statements regarding individuals present or absent and sectarian, religious, partisan, political, or aesthetic ideologies for their own sake. In case of disagreement, we believe that all statements made in our community must be first heard, and then the parties submit to mediation until cordiality is resumed, or to the point of, I can live with this. Moderators will perform the duty of umpire of their own sessions. Infractions will lead to a warning and then ejection from a session upon a second occurrence. Judgment calls may not be questioned in real time. Session infractions will be addressed within 48 hours of the event, that's after tomorrow's closing, by a quorum of 3 event organizers as elected by the organizing committee. The audience, by participating, is agreeing to a media release that we can use the videos and chat and citations, quotations, and so on and so forth for the use of the Classic Planning Institute and the STOA, and especially with regard to creating a book at the end of the process. We are thinking of doing. Continuing education units are available upon request. They are self-reporting units. We are working to get AIA approval, and we need everybody who wants a certificate to sign up at CGI at classicplanning.com, and then we're going to ask you to actually help us out. It'll be a cute program, but everybody's going to have to pitch in to make it work. Can you give? If every attendee of this STOA event donated $5, we could sponsor 2 students to learn traditional architecture and classic planning at the CPI. So do go to this QR code or to classicplanning.org/give. Those who know me are aware of the fact that I am excited these days to be involved in the Extreme City Makeover video series, that I love designing beautiful buildings, and I really, really enjoy helping communities become masters of their destiny. The CPI itself stewards the classical method knowledge bases as described in part in the Art of Classic Planning. The values unique to the CPI, and I will argue that they're really unique and set us apart from virtually all the other institutions and organizations in our field, is that we consider architecture central to urbanism. We are genuinely holistic. We understand town and country and their organic relationship. And we understand today more than ever that crafts are essential. They might be essential for the manual construction, might be essential for human, societal, and planetary well-being. The 5 divisions of the Classic Planning Institute are the studio, the academy, the research lab, the library, and the STOA. So far, we have here discussed some of the research yesterday. The library project is an ongoing thing to bring together the knowledge bases of the classical method. I don't believe there are 1,000 books actually that in here that information. The unique professional training curriculum that we are designing, planning, and applying has prerequisites from academia, CPI coursework, trades experience, travel requirements, and apprenticeship. And I don't know of any shortcuts to this. And many of us who are in the movement have actually done this for ourselves one way or another. The first year includes architectural literacy, classic planning, and a 100-year plan studio. We're going to be running another first year this year. And the architectural literacy part of it includes the orders, but also proportions, composition, and two projects, small and medium. Classic planning basics are taught in 6 consecutive classes, and then people go into the 100-year plan studio, where they go from these diagrammatic exercises straight into genuine urbanism and architecture. Everything we do is graduate level, but highly accessible. Contact us at classicplanning.org. If anybody has a book, The Classic Art of Classic Planning, and would like to have a signed book plate, please let me know. Write to me at CGI@classicplanning.com. This is our gateway to the beautiful days that we are having here. We are in the 3rd day. The first day was all about the completion of Washington, D.C., and it was a pretty wild session, if you've heard anything about it. 2nd day was all about neuroscience and making, and there were some really amazing conversations that ensued, and we saw the movie Built Beautiful. Today, halfway through, we're going to see the movie And the Alley She Whitewashed in Light Blue, which is about place and a very special connection to place. But the actual session is going to be led and followed. We're going to follow Robert Adam in his presentation of Somewhere and Everywhere, Populism versus Globalism, with the moderator, James McCreary, who's going to lead a genuinely illustrious panel of individuals from around the world. Tomorrow, Andres Duani is going to be closing tag the STOA with Don't Tell Me Anything I Could Have Heard in the 20th Century, and I'd like to actually extend that to Don't Tell Me Anything I Could Have Heard Before COVID. The world is a new place, and we're going to have a wonderful set of people, some of them from the leading edge of the architectural rebellion and so on and so forth, speaking, really people who are in the thought leadership of the younger folks these days. So welcome to day 3. And is Nicholas Boyce Smith here already?
Yes, he is.
Wonderful. So I'd like to introduce Nicholas Boyce Smith, who is, I think he's one of our heroes, all things being equal. He is the founding director of Create Streets and the Create Streets Foundation. He was co-chair with the late Sir Roger Scruton of the UK government Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and its final report, Living with Beauty. While widely praised, it is influencing the debate on planning and placemaking globally. It has been described as seminal and as one of the most important recent reports. The executive summary says something like, ask for beauty, refuse ugliness, promote stewardship. With statements like this, we know how we know how Nicholas Boyce Smith is thinking about things, and his leadership is extraordinary. You can see here from this rendering of one of his from Create Streets. And he is doing it both on the community level and on the governmental level in ways that are truly amazing. With the Planning for the Future white paper that he co-wrote in 2020. And he was recently asked to chair the UK government's new Office of Place. He's been also instrumental in the National Model Design Code. So I want to welcome you to day 3 at the STOA. We have here today a representation on the panel from the Catholic University of America, the Classic Planning Institute, Create Streets, Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, INTBAU, International Society of Biourbanism, National Civic Art Society, the traditional architecture group at the RIBA and Utah Valley University. What I would like to kick off is thinking in general about the institutional leadership on both sides of the Atlantic has really been the strongest mover of the traditional needle. I would like to know at the end of the day who the young leadership are, what's the forecast in the next year to 5 years, and are we entering a new era of diversity and tolerance? Right now, I'm turning the conversation over to Nicholas Boyce Smith. Nicholas, podium is yours.
Sorry, I couldn't get my mute off there. Let me just share my screen. Bear with me, forgive me. You think after 2 years you'd know how to do this, but one can still make mistakes. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just bringing up full screen. That was a slightly too generous introduction, but thank you very much indeed, Nia. What I thought I'd do, and I think I've just got just a little bit over 10 minutes, hopefully very much in the spirit of that rather over generous introduction, is just tell you a little bit about Create Streets, which is the social enterprise I founded 8 or 9 years ago, tell you a little bit about the work of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and what effect it's starting to have, and then probably very briefly, because it really remains very nascent, tell you a little bit about what the Office for Place in England, and I say England because it is English-wide, not UK-wide, is planning to do. And I'll be delighted then to hand over to Robert Adam, who needs no introduction and who is very much one of the key movers and shakers in that. So, I mean, I don't come from a design background. I'm not an architect. I'm not a planner. I'm not even a developer. I was a banker for my many sins. That's not a fashionable thing to admit to anymore. And before that, I was a strategy consultant, which is probably even worse. I started getting frustrated with what was happening to London, which is it's where I live, is my city. In fact, I've been getting frustrated with it all my adult life, perhaps before then even. That started sort of activating itself about 10 years ago as I drove past the Aylesbury estate, which is a big brutalist post-war housing estate in South London. And I noticed they were starting to knock some of it down, and I was curious as to what they were going to put in its place. And I Googled it, which is now Verb. And at a very superficial level, I was very discombobulated by what I saw and curious as to why it was happening. It seemed to me as a market failure. And so I started asking questions and going to talk to people. And the more I read about it and the more I scratched at the evidence on what people like and where they're happy and why and how the market for creation of places and the design process works in the UK initially, the more I thought, I think increasingly confidently, that something was very fundamentally wrong in the process that creates places and its ability to make places we like to be in. And so that's why I set up Create Streets, and because I think I came to the view that no one who I could find who was talking about this was doing so in a way that I would thought would impact, a pension fund investor or a senior official at the Treasury, which is our financial wing of government. So we're a social enterprise and a charity. We do the research into the sorts of places people like, either primary or secondary. We work, initially it was entirely with neighbourhood groups to try and put that into life. Initially it was always sort of counter proposals. Something big was coming down the line, the neighbourhood didn't like it, and we helped them work up something that was at least credibly commercially viable and that was better and more popular. And initially we lost all those battles. We are now starting to win some of those battles. Actually, we're winning quite a few. And actually now we're increasingly working for local government and for landowners as well. And we, as Nia alluded to, we, and particularly I, have taken quite an active role in the debate about planning and placemaking in the UK. So this is a recent book, well, now a couple of years ago, that we published called Of Streets and Squares, which tried to summarize the evidence on the types of places people like and why. This is a co-design session in a housing estate in West London with one of our colleagues, or one of our I should say, architects we work with, Francis Terry, there on the right-hand side. We also work with Robert. We're very keen on engaging wide as well as engaging deep. So as well as running workshops and co-design sessions, we've created an online platform, which we call Create Communities, which allows us incredibly cheaply, and we can literally do it for almost free if we want to, we do normally charge, to to ask people what types of place they like. What's their favorite place in a local area? Where do they feel scared? Where do they feel happy? What would they like to see more of? What would they like to see less of? We're trying to crowdsource popularity, and it's an incredibly enriching and encouraging thing to do. As I say, we're not about traditional or non-traditional architecture. We're about places that people like, but it leads to quite consistent responses. Neil's already alluded to this. This was literally our very first scheme. This is when, oddly, I was running Create Streets out of the room I'm now in, but it was just me around this table 6-7 years ago, where we came up with a counter proposal that was actually slightly denser, slightly more homes than the rather lumpish thing that the Royal Mail was proposing, but which could win off the scale local support. And we did. We polled locally on it. We're very interested in how you can weave a city back together. This is what we call a Boxlands scheme in London. We're increasingly working on design codes. We're not architects, though we do have a couple of architects in the team now, but we're very much about trying to help councils and landowners, commercial investors to set the brief. So we just stop producing the sort of rubbish that in this country, and sadly in many other countries, we have been producing now for several generations. This is from a brief and a master plan that we've been helping a landowner in Hampshire in South England put together. So not in Hampshire, it doesn't matter where. This is a community co-led scheme we're working on, a rather important church, St George in the East in Tower Hamlets, so Nicholas Hawksmoor Church. I think I always resist having a favourite architect, but other than Robert Adam, of course, I think Nicholas Hawksmoor might be it actually. His inventiveness within a tradition is just astonishing. Bombed, as you can see, in 1941. And you can just see on the picture on the right how there were houses going around the church, which were like this church bombed 80 years ago. And we're working with local residents, both the local parish and local mosque, local Catholic church, to actually try to put back housing where it used to be, and bringing into play land for housing. And as you won't be surprised to hear, there's obviously a massive affordability crisis in London, to bring back into play land that would never normally be considered for housing. It's right by an important listed protected monument, because it will be community led, because it will be beautiful, because it will provide housing people are looking for. This is another similar scheme, well, not similar, but has some similarities we're working on in Sunderland, which is a very poor community in northeast England, where the terraced housing was destroyed in the 1970s. Working through a series of workshops, we're working up a scheme to very much put those houses back. We're also about bringing the research into the public debate. So looking at the evidence, for example, on the fact that people like a bit of colour. People like places and buildings and images which are a bit more symmetrical. This is some pricing analysis we did on every single property sale in London and also in 5 other cities in 2016, which showed that, if you like, the premium of place was between 4 and 7 times higher than the premium for new build. That was not a popular finding amongst many surveyors. This is a more recent research we did looking at an algorithm of types of popular places, images that people liked, where we scored, I forget how many thousands of places, and we're able to then map that back to components of what's rather pompously called urban morphology. And what we find, I mean, I'm massively simplifying here to go through at huge speed, was that, actually traditional places, conventional places with older buildings and more variegated use, as well as being worth more, are more popular. People prefer the look of them. And this is quite important research, because this stops it being about, I like this, you like that. This is pulling out very consistent slopes and trends in the data. Just to bring that to life for you, these are some of the less popular places, and these are some of the more popular places. And they have very consistent themes of variety in a pattern, coherent complexity, often but not always greenery, but quite well composed and structured and enclosed. We're also about trying to get the academic research and take it out of, buried away in academic documents and bring it into the public debate in a way that can influence officials or politicians or decision makers. This is quite an important and very robust Dutch study showing that I've gone forward, let's go back again, showing that more traditionally conceived and built places are bluntly worth more. So why wouldn't you do that? And then we try and summarize it. This is a little leaflet we produce. Right, conscious of time, I will speed up. We also run conferences, and we're very much not about design per se, but pulling that into the wider theme of how we live as a community, how we live as a society. We'll be launching a major conference. We've just launched it actually literally this morning. Restitch the Social Fabric Summit, as in the States, so in the UK. How we live together as a society is very important. So we're trying to link that into issues of place and design. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which Nia referred to, I mean, very much, I think, coming from some of the noise that we and others were making, was set up right at the end of 2018, chaired by Sir Roger Scruton, and we published our final report in January 2 years ago, just before the COVID wave broke upon us all. I became co-chair alongside Sir Roger about halfway through, or a bit before halfway through. I drafted the interim report, and between us, we drafted the final report. The lovely quote that Nia made earlier was very much Roger's summary of where our thinking got to. He wrote far better than I will ever do. It was quite a full-on process. So we spoke to lots of people. We visited many places. We had a major call for evidence. We were doing it in the context of the need for new homes, carbon neutrality, trying to bring places back. And despite the fact that our report, or our research, I should say, when it started, was very controversial, I think we're fair to say that the design and development communities were very uncomfortable with the brief and with Roger's role, particularly, with mine to perhaps a slightly lesser extent. We actually came across very consistent evidence that people weren't happy with the types of places we were creating. We were deluged with spontaneous approaches from the public. And when surveys were done on our behalf by both the Royal Town Planners Institute and by Civic Voice, which is a network of community groups in the UK, actually what was being poo-pooed by many was found to be very important. People actually did want to create beautiful and lovely places. It's a word that is quite endemic in normal life, though not one that professionals feel comfortable with. And the importance of development in making places better, we very much tried to bring visually to life, as here, alongside the statistical evidence that we alluded, as well as about very important questions about land use. This is a comparison that one of my team did, looking at the land use of Siena versus a highway interchange in the States. I won't go through all of our quite detailed policy proposals. They were quite detailed, underpinning those summaries, but we did have quite, I think, important things to say about the way the planning system works in the UK, that should be more visual, more popular, about how the tax system works, and that it needs to start encouraging stewardship as opposed to encouraging short-term development, which is what it currently does, and also about the way in which the British government, above all, engages with the planning and development system. At the moment, it is encouraging local councils to build cheaper, worse, short-lasting, ugly buildings. It's not sort of deliberately setting out to do so, but that is what it does. I'm not going to go through our proposals in detail, but we set out, we thought, how they could be implemented over time. We got a very warm response, both from the government and perhaps more surprisingly from most, not quite all, from most of the industry. And that's led to a programme of policy announcements over the last couple of years. And I don't want to be naive. There's still a lot that's wrong. There's still a lot that should be improved. But I think we are definitely seeing improvements. So we're certainly seeing some of the volume house builders worrying about biodiversity more. We're certainly seeing them starting to worry about the quality and popularity of what they produce in a way they just weren't a couple of years ago. There are some now quite important hooks in what's called the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the sort of the core document underneath statute in the UK, about the importance of beauty, placemaking, emphasis on good design, asking local authorities to produce design codes, asking for streets to be tree lined, looking for improving biodiversity net gain, and also that popularity of local plans and of supplementary documents is a key part of the process of creating plans. So it's going to take some time for those changes to filter through on the ground. And some, as I say, some I think are starting to. Most immediately, within a year, the government published the National Model Design Code, which actually is a very good document. I didn't write it, but both I and Robert and others were we're trying to influence it and get the brief right. And I think it has come out as a good document that is already starting to have a positive effect on the importance of placemaking, enclosure and design. And then just quickly, and I'm conscious of time, it wasn't actually a direct recommendation of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, though we did say there should be a body to monitor its implementation. And then a few months later, I was asked to chair the advisory process to start thinking about that new body. I have a great panel, great board members, some MPs, some pollsters, architects, including Robert Adam, former politicians and planners. We've set our vision, which again, I'm not going to read to you at every level, but is about a fundamental change in how in Britain and England we create places to be more popular and more healthy. and supporting the industry to move in that direction. It's in this context that the British people have lost trust in the planning and development process. 2% trust developers on large site and 7% trust councils. That's clearly not good enough. We want to move, and this is a graphic from the B4C report, from a vicious circle of poor placemaking and opposition to new development to a more virtuous circle of seeing development as more likely to be a good thing. We've set out what our likely core areas of activity will be: researching, supporting and accrediting good design codes in good places, training, sharing best practice, celebrating good practice, and not the first thing we'll start doing, but probably the last, and then advising bits of other bits of government. And we're now starting the process of working out what that will be. In all honesty, it's taking longer than I would like it to, but it takes much quicker to set up a social enterprise than it is to set up a new bit of government, which I guess is fair enough. And I think that's probably it. So I think there's all to play for, but lots still needs to be done. I think that's my allotted, probably a little bit more than my allotted 10 minutes. So please forgive me if I overran. Have I stopped sharing? I think I have. Bear with me. And I think it is now my huge honor and pleasure to introduce someone who I suspect doesn't actually need any introduction, Professor Robert Adam, surely only a matter of time before he's Professor Sir Robert Adam, surely, who has got the right name to be a traditional architect at any rate, and many other things. Winner of the scholarship to the British School in Rome, founder of Robert Adam Architects, now the largest architectural practice, traditional architecture practice in the UK, probably one of the largest in Europe. Winning the Dreyhouse Prize, huge number. Oh, you've brought up a slide on him, marvelous. Huge number of important schemes, and also a prolific writer, both of many books and of journalism, is engaged in the public debate on architecture. So, did you want to be speaking to these? I didn't realise that there were slides. Sorry, but I'm happy to hand back over to you. But has engaged, I think, in the debate about planning and placemaking, certainly in the UK, and I think more widely, probably more than any other traditional architect over the last generation. So it gives me great pleasure to shush and hand over to Robert.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Welcome, Robert. I think I have another slide or two of your work. I think just to lead into your conversation, if I'm not mistaken, you find that the economic and cultural globalization, which began in about 1990, ended in 2008. There's been a slow return to localization, and in the US and the UK, this political shift has been recorded in the idea, and I think you're going to have to say this yourself, the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres are people who are local, and the anywheres who are people who are sort of transnational, people with transnational interests. It also has to do on the global level with the departure of the UK from the European Union, regional politics in Spain, and the reassertion of nationalism in Russia, China, and elsewhere. But I think that the evidence that the entrenched design professions are becoming less dogmatic than they might have been is there to a certain degree. And then the emerging question, and I think this is what where I hand it off to you, is whether we're entering a new era of diversity and tolerance. Robert Adam.
Thank you. I shall now try and share my screen. And somewhere on that I have it. There it is. Thank you, Neil, for giving my lecture in advance. And thank you, Nicholas. You'll hear me all right?
Yes.
You're good. And no, I'll be in touch with you later, Nicholas. I know you have to go off to a social occasion. Anyway, I'm actually going to. Neil's already given half my speech, so I can probably cut it down. But I'm going to actually take this into a much broader field, so forgive me. And it does actually, in the end, come down to we talk about institutions. Is what Nicholas and I are working on, or I'm working with Nicholas on, which is the Office Replaced, is precisely one of those institutions. which in England has taken on a governmental aspect, which I don't know if that is unique. I know there is there was a similar plan. I don't know if it came to anything of law in the Italian region of Puglia, but I don't know if it came to anything, but something very similar was happening there. So I shall just now launch into this. I know I'm not supposed to talk about anything that could have happened, I could have said in the 20th century. That's a bit tricky, actually, because, you know, I had to reinvent my language. But what I'm going to talk about does actually start just at the end of the 20th century. And I have to introduce it with this because I think the legacy of this is still with us. Indeed, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine is precisely a legacy of this. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, which led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. A whole series of events happened at this time. The reopening of the Shanghai Stock Exchange in 1990, the liberalization of the Indian economy about the same time, Blair House Accord, where the United States and the EU effectively created the World Trade Organization. So all of these things happened, and they created a particular phase in globalization. And these are statements of people at the time. I just ask you, I mean, I'm not going to read these out because it's boring reading out things that are written on screens. And I know you can all read quickly. But remember these statements because I'm going to contrast them with other statements later on. Different times, actually, but it's interesting, 2009, when I'll get to with Hu Jintao. But this was the principle was that everyone accepted that really we were in a new era of global interaction. And then we had the G20 and G7, which still persist. A little aside in this, just a little side about globalization, with one or two exceptions. I think the foreign minister of Kuwait, and I also think the Modi, the Indian prime minister. Other than that, everyone is wearing a dark suit. You notice that. This would normally, if we actually wore what some of they were wearing, we would be accused of cultural appropriation. But actually, the world has culturally appropriated the North Atlantic form of formal dress, as indeed they have also appropriated what I would loosely call North Atlantic modernist architecture, which has its origins in Europe and the United States. These two illustrations at the top I particularly like because they are advertisements which actually sort of roll up a series of iconic buildings to make them into a place. But they could have vaguely look, the view from the sea, like downtown Manhattan, which is another interesting thing because downtown Manhattan, of course, is the financial center of the world. So that's what happened actually out there politically and economically, and it had its interesting reflection in architecture. This is a survey I did in about 2010, where actually on the left-hand side is the number of architects that actually started to act globally. And you can see it took off dramatically in 97, 98, 99. And it's interesting to see the firms of the countries that where global architects started to practice. All the dominant ones, including Hong Kong, which is largely British founded firms, are all Anglophone. So the dominance of North Atlantic culture in globalization is evident in architecture. And then we have what Hans Evelings called super modernity, where basically it didn't matter what it is. If you put it in a glass box, it was fine. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. And it launched, and actually very specifically was launched by the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which was conceived in 1991 and completed in 1997. It set off the iconic building phenomenon. Awful lot of these buildings, which you can see take a huge amount of time to get going, were actually commissioned after Bilbao published a thing called the Bilbao Effect, which said that this had a huge impact on city economies. And it's how cities competed with one another on a global stage. These are just big billboards for city economies. City economies often running contrary or in opposition in many respects, or competing with their own national economies. The idea that the city is a place in which to trade globally became very important. I won't go into the design of these. There's lots of lovely stories about them, but I don't have time really. And this makes its way also into urban design. Of course, the thing about a lot of the urban design at this time is that actually the building is the dominant thing. And in fact, a lot of the urban design is, although it'll, has to do various things like have streets and parks and so on, a lot of it is just about showing off buildings. So you end up with very large amounts of space, the purpose of which is to show off buildings. And the wider phenomenon of this is what's called homogenization. And again, the countries that did most successfully in this were the North Atlantic countries, which had already established themselves as international players. Interesting enough, the Starbucks was banned from the Forbidden City in Beijing. They said, well, you could do it if you could take the Starbucks sign away. But the Starbucks sign was so important, they decided they couldn't operate at all. So actually the idea of these logos and how you operate it became very important. And the result of this, of course, was that basically, and of course, all of these places are different because people drive on different sides of the road and speak differently and so on. But certainly superficially, very well recognized that a lot of cities just began to look the same. And that's kind of the architectural consequence of globalization. There was another side to this, which I loosely call localization, which, interesting enough, happened at about the same time. A whole series of political events. Obviously, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which is rebounding on us at the moment. The Indian Constitution was amended to give more autonomy to individual states. Canada created Nunavut, an Inuit governed province. And interestingly, the northern Italy decided we should create a new state called Padania, because they really hated the people in the south of Italy and thought they were all wastrels and corrupt. And there are lots of other examples of this, and conveniently written in English. We were informed that Catalonia is not Spain. Bavaria, the Kingdom of Bavaria, they wear shorts, and in the newly autonomous part of Scotland, they all wear kilts, or they don't all wear kilts. They never did all wear kilts. And of course, the Sami, in fact, the Sami in Northern Europe, which are a transnational migratory group, actually got Sweden gave them their own parliament much earlier. It's one of the very early examples. So running alongside this was actually loosely called localization. It's a whole political aspect to this. If you are a nation, there's certain things you need to command: your own economy, your own army, and your own finance. Well, you can command your own army, but you can't really command your own economy anymore, and you can't really command your own financial institutions anymore. So that is naturally, this opened this up, and it had an addition of places needing to be more identifiable. There are kind of two responses to this. One was identity as just being identifiable. In other words, if you made it different enough, or put some vague symbol on it. This is in the left here. This is England. This is a place which was known. Leicester was known for lace. So in order to show that, someone produced a very abstract pattern of lace and stuck it on a glass box. That was enough to make it local. And then, of course, there's identity of place, which Neo conveniently showed this picture before. I have to include some of my own work in this. So there's an interesting aspect of localization at this time. And again, interesting enough, corresponding really pretty much around the same time. And here I put dates on them. There's the Vision of Europe, which was actually established by Gabriele Tagliaventi in 1992. It's a kind of reflection of the Princess Wales vision of Britain. And obviously very, very important is the Congress for New Urbanism. INTBAU was created in 2000. Council of European Urbanism, effectively an outshoot of Congress for New Urbanism. In 2006, the Academy of Urbanism in the UK. I was involved in at least 3 of these. But interestingly, we start to actually piece them together. This is an aspect. So what we, in a way, and then in a way that, so I think the reflection of this is interesting because here we have Malmö in Sweden, which is a kind of modernist response, if you like, to the idea of being local. And then the very famous and much more literal example in Paris. So this was there were reflections of this in a number of places. But broadly speaking, you had two things kind of tussling with one another all the time, was this homogenization and localization. Then something very important happened. 2008, we had an economic collapse. I have to say that all of this is based on a fundamental principle, which I didn't start off with, is that architecture is not distinct from social, political, and economic events. And in fact, architecture is secondary or tertiary to social, political, and economic events. So if you're going to understand what's happening in architecture, you have to understand the social, political, and economic background. And this was the economic crash. 2008 went right through 2013. This had a very, very significant impact. If you like, this marked the sort of end of this, to some extent, of this globalizing phenomenon. And then we had here we have a sort of great deceleration. These are the famous BRICS of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, who were rushing ahead, which actually slowed down. China's actually taken off again, but I don't think really Brazil, India, and Russia have, or Russia's taken off in an entirely different way, of course. But the other thing that happens very important is this. I've chosen India just to show, I'm not talking about India to great length, but India is a place of huge potential, which apparently is not fully realized. But I think this is the thing that frightens the United States to some extent, and this is purchasing power parity in terms of GDP. Is how China, by purchasing power parity, puts it on a much more social level. It's already in terms of GDP terms, it's probably overtaken the United States, but in purchasing power parity, in other words, what people can actually buy for their money, China is billed to overtake the United States in a few years. This is a significant economic event. At the same time, another thing that arose out of this was populism. And populism, I'm very careful. I mean, I'm talking about politics. I'm noticing Near's earlier thing. Be very careful talking about politics in all this, but you can't avoid politics. I'm not going to make any judgments on these, but these are all aspects of populism. We have the Freedom Party at the bottom left, or the Front National in France, UKIP was now not defunct, or we have the True Finn Party at the top, the Cinque Stelle in Italy, and Donald Trump. A particularly helpful photograph of Donald Trump there. But the principle being that generally summarized as populism. I just threw in the Republic of California, and I could have actually had the Lone Star State as well as the idea that these places should be independent. I mean, populism is a reflection of a phenomenon, and I think one would be very unwise, one would be very negative about populism, and particularly people like us, which I'll get to. But nonetheless, you ignore these things at your peril, and they may be a reflection of something much wider, which I believe they are. And if you remember these first quotations, which I gave you from leaders of 3 countries, and contrast them with these 3 quotations and look at the year. These are all, if you like, something asking people to draw back from a sort of global cultural and economic phenomenon. I'll leave you a moment to read these. They don't take long to read because they're not very long. But it's an interesting contrast when you put these against one another. But of course, the architecture and architects particularly move very slowly. They abandon. I mean, not all of us are spring chickens, and our ideas last for a long time, and our companies last for a long time, and indeed, people seeking status, as the people believe they got status from iconic buildings, they'll carry on. These things don't die overnight. However, I wanted to actually, this is interesting. If you're dealing with sort of historical phenomena, it's always good to have markers. And of course, there at the Guggenheim, this is a thing that, you know, the face that launched 1,000 ships, but it was the building that launched 1,000 icons. Its period of time is a perfect match, actually, for the. But then what happened? There you see the Helsinki, the idea that they would have a Guggenheim in Helsinki was proposed in 2009, and it was rejected. And it was rejected by local government. Interesting grounds. It was called Starbucks museology, or McDonald's-like franchise. It's very clear that in that particular moment in the government of Helsinki, that they didn't really like the idea of a global phenomenon coming to them. They thought they thought this was inappropriate. Just literally this year, mind you, probably for other reasons, it would have been cancelled anyway at the moment. But the Hermitage, it was going to building by Toyo Ito, was going to put up a building in Barcelona to subcontract the very large amount of work it had in its cellars. And that was rejected because, and I quote, the authorities in Barcelona, because it wasn't indigenous and wasn't rooted in the territory, to quote. So these are very interesting markers. I mean, you know, you look for historical markers, so this is something else that's going on. It's interesting that it's, you know, we have two Bs each. We have Bilbao, Barcelona, actually two regions of Spain, which in themselves have very strong regional identities, to the extent of in Catalonia, and in fact was very, very much so in the Basque region, wanting to be entirely separate. But that's another story. So we have in my view, we have a very significant change taking place. Now, this was a 2008 diagram done by economists at the World Bank. It's called the elephant graph. And this actually explains the rise of populism. It's a very important diagram. If you look at how at the left, you can see the emerging economies growing, China, India, and so on. And for that matter, Russia could be regarded as a rising economy. But however, look at to the right. Now, the word middle class, it means something different in Britain than it does in the United States. And this is the United States type of middle class. It's an ordinary working person. Is their standard of living declined, and the booming global elite took off. This is a mark of change, the change in it. So if you want to actually have sort of economic, social and economic picture of what came about with populism, this is a very powerful diagram called the elephant graph. It looks vaguely like an elephant. The important thing is a book came out in Britain by David Goodhart, which was called The Road to Somewhere. And this, through analysis, to a significant extent in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, which actually divided these two groups of people up into anywheres and somewheres. And just to illustrate it, in two British cases, there's a place called Cranbrook in Kent, an historic town, which is a somewhere, and a piece of post-war development in a major city in Britain called Birmingham, which is an anywhere. And this division is actually quite important, and I'll get to, because actually, in a way, all of us here are anywheres who want to be somewheres. So this is anywhere. We've looked at this. This is Dubai Airport, and the City of London could be anywhere. It's called non-place. Although that you could vaguely work that as Dubai if you carefully looked at some of the details. But really, airports could be anywhere, and indeed financial centers could be anywhere. And these are all somewheres. So the thing about somewheres, and the division of this group is very interesting, is it conforms to this elephant graph. Anywheres are people with higher education, more mobility, and more internationalism. Well, the mere fact that we're here as an international group kind of demonstrates that in theoretical way, I'm sure all of us have a higher education, that we belong to that group of people, which is in the upper quartile of income. What's happened though is that the somewheres and these are defined as middling income, lower three quartile income, very much larger group of people, more geographically distributed, but politically very weak, value family and tradition and home and place. And historically in this period, they've actually moved around a great deal less. So somewhere, something that is locked in the traditions of the place. And so now interesting, so that's if you like, the reflection of populism and how, in a way, that it conforms to certain ideas about the built environment. As I say, it's interesting because all of us here, demographic sense, sit in the anywhere group, but I'm fairly sure that all of us here psychologically want to belong to the somewhere group. But this has had an effect, and this is really what I think what I'd like to try and make into a useful discussion. It has had an effect, even in mainstream architecture. I mean, I don't want things to. I mean, a lot of these British architects, but this is the David Chipperfield working very on the left, working very much internationally. Every time anyone says what he's doing is sort of vaguely classical, he says, "Oh no, it's not." But I'm afraid it is. I'm asked to join a video test, so I'm not quite what that's for. Something strange come up on my screen. Right, Caruso Syngent in again, actually a firm which has declared themselves to be interested in introducing. And these are what I loosely call mainstream firms. Obviously, that what's happened with that strange thing that came on my screen is that it stopped me changing my. Oh, there we are. Here again. There's a firm called McCrone and Lavington. I did actually say to them when I looked at this building they had done, I said, well, I could have done that if I stuck a cornice on it. This is in Britain, this is called the London vernacular now. It's basically paint on brick. But nonetheless, it has the idea has a very strong affinity with what is traditional in London. It tends to use vertical format windows, punch holes and punch hole windows, and it comes in various forms. I get this strange breakout room in progress coming up. It's gone now. It is having an effect on mainstream architecture. I mean, Van der Heggen is a mainstream modernist. Have you some of his other buildings, but this is a very similar phenomenon in the Netherlands to what's happening with the London vernacular. I'll be very interested to hear from people. I'm also getting a strange breakout room thing on here. Is anyone else getting this? This card keeps popping up. I'll be interested to hear if this phenomenon is existing in other places as well. But certainly it is in my opinion, it is a reflection of this broad movement. And indeed, when I started looking at my own work, and it's not now working here either. So where was I? So I think in order to actually see that what I call mainstream architecture in another light, I looked at some of the aspects of my own buildings, and when you actually strip these buildings back, or aspects of these buildings, one's a library in Oxford and the other's an office building, the rear of an office building, actually the similarities become important. Now, I'll get back to this in a minute, because there's a statement I really want to make at the end about this. But I think the other area which is particularly interesting is that of urban design. Obviously, architects get very worked up about what buildings look like, and they divide themselves up by what buildings look like. Urban design is another matter, really. There is a surprising consensus, at least rhetorically, about what urban design should be like. It should be walkable. There should be less cars. People should be closer to one another. The work of Jane Jacobs has been widely accepted. There's a surprising amount of rhetorical unanimity on this point. I went to a talk actually in Libya before they got rid of Colonel Gaddafi, and one of the Foster Associates, one of the major architects, they gave a talk about this wonderful piece of urban design they were doing, and I thought, my God, I could have said all that. It's exactly what I would have said. And then they showed us what it looked like, and of course, I realized that a lot of this was just rhetoric. But nonetheless, rhetoric is at least a start. So the idea that you should, and here we have, consult publicly, work together with people on projects, and as Nicholas was saying, have a situation where ordinary citizens can actually play their part in this, is becoming widely accepted. And interestingly, I mean, here are two designs by mainstream architects in Britain, Allies and Morrison, and his Northwest Bicester and Farrell's. I mean, these aren't dissimilar. I mean, because in the States you tend to produce more orthogonal grids, but it'd be fair to say that in Britain we don't tend to do that so much for historical reasons. I've got this little card coming up again, and it keeps on coming up. And I'm going to go not now, right. Particularly these are, I wouldn't exactly have produced these plans, but these are plans that could well have been produced by people involved in what I call contextual urbanism. Call it new urbanism or contextual urbanism. Its unifying factor is that people are concerned with context. But when you actually start to look at what they put in them, there we are. This is remarkably familiar. The one on the top is called this is my favorite expression, is a new Middle Eastern vernacular. Well, I think about new and vernacular as they don't quite work together. But vernacular is a much misused expression. And then in the other master plan, the Bicester master plan, of course, we got timber-clad boxes with glass balconies. Nevertheless, I think the urban design one is interesting because I think a lot of, in simple urban design terms, a lot of battles have been won. But actually, when you get to the architecture, they just can't help themselves. And then here we have what I would loosely call the more traditional contextual urbanism, which is, this is work done, and top here is Nansleden by Hugh Petter, my former firm, and another master plan in England. These are contextual, and the architecture again reflects that, is a much greater tolerance of the kind of things that we are doing than I did 10, 15 years ago. I think it's a general institutional tolerance, and I actually think there's less dogma. I also think there's less dogma in architecture schools. I think that the students are not terribly interested in dogma anymore. If we are, we're all here to try and make life better for everybody and to improve the world. So do we do this by telling other people that they're all idiots and shouldn't be doing what they're doing? Or do we do this by finding out ways that we can associate with one another and learn from one another? I mean, one can always learn from other people. My instinct is it's the latter. I don't want to go throughout my career telling perfectly decent people that they're idiots and they're completely doing the wrong thing. Although I might think they're doing the wrong thing, I know they're not idiots. So I really want to make this, this is kind of, to finish off, this is what the subject is supposed to be about, is kind of an institutional point. I mean, in the UK, the RIBA, the Traditional Architecture Group, also called TAG, confusingly, is a part of the RIBA. And successive presidents have agreed that traditional architecture should be something that the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, the equivalent of the AIA, should become a part of that group. So I think our battle's being won. I think there's a reasonably fertile field at the moment. I think politically, socially, and economically, there is a reasonably fertile field. Architects move slowly. They're very dogmatic. Things will not change overnight. But my personal belief is that we will all gain more by finding how we associate with architects with whom we disagree in the interest of debate, than we will by saying that they're all doing it completely wrong and ought to go away, because they're not going to go away. I mean, to be clear about that, it's not going to happen. But however, changes are taking place. Those changes are slow. And I believe that institutionally, we would do better to seek association with these groups of people than we would to put ourselves in opposition to them. And so that's really the end of my talk. And I hope that gives people some basis for further discussion. I shall now stop my share.